Hello and welcome. I'm Johannah Knudson, and this is my Superstition Review Authors Talk. Many thanks to Superstition Review for inviting me to contribute to this series and for including my poem Cosmology Fourscore in issue 20, the 10th anniversary issue of Superstition Review. So congratulations to the entire Superstition Review staff for that achievement. I'm going to be speaking about two main things. First of all, to give a little bit of background into my poem, Cosmology Fourscore, and then I'll touch a little bit on my current main creative project, which is a biography with the working title Transylvania Blue, and I'm blogging about that as well at transylvaniablue.com if you want more information. That said, Cosmology Fourscore, for some context, you might want to read that poem and listen to me reciting it at the Superstition Review website under issue 20, the poetry section, and just look for my name there and you'll find my author's page. So the poem obviously begins with an allusion to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And the reason that line is in my head is because in 8th grade I had to memorize that entire speech and perform it in front of the class, which was a daunting task for me, being, especially at the time, a reserved person and not a naturally motivated performer. So I got through that, and I think I got a C on that assignment. But the benefit of that really was that for decades now, the rhythms of that speech have been in my mind and have really integrated into my synapses. And finally, this poem, that was sort of the seed of this poem. And what propels it forward, kind of the energy and the rhythm and the poeticism of that speech. And I think another issue with including that speech is sort of the authority that it allowed me to take, the voice of authority. It's such an iconic speech. And so to begin with that was maybe an audacious claim on an authority that is not allowed to all people. Audacious because I simply claim that authority because I could as a poet, and that's one of our privileges as poets, to speak from whatever position we wish to within the poetic context. And hopefully in the larger context of the world, we're given an equal kind of authority that we want to take on as well. So that's the seed of the poem, is Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And from there, I think it moves to different issues of power and authority. Certainly in the first stanza, there's the issue of naming and being called certain names, being called various names, being labeled different things. So the issue of internal versus external authority is definitely present. Getting into the second stanza, there are images of crossing a border and dealing with a border guard and being subjected to various indignities and interrogations, and very much power, the issue of power and movement, human movement, who has the right to move where, and who defines what's here and what's there, and how one travels from here to there, and what we might be subject to when we're trying to make those kinds of movements. And again, the strict definition that's involved in having national boundaries or borders of any kind, whether it's a nation or an identity or a body. And within that, subjects of violence certainly come up. And I wrote this poem quite a few years ago, and it was interesting to revisit it at this time because so many of these themes are major issues in our politics right now. So the poem kind of takes on a different meaning within this context for me, or certain elements are emphasized maybe more than they would have been otherwise, and that's one of them, the issue of movement across national boundaries, and what are national boundaries, and how does one attempt to shore up national boundaries, and what are the motivations for that effort. From there, in stanza 3, I talk a little bit about this concept of the sovereign, or the empire, or the monarchy, and some really, literal imagery of taking control, taking power. And when I wrote this, I wasn't exactly comfortable with it, and honestly wasn't necessarily comfortable with sharing this with others because it struck me as violent. And of course it is violent, the imagery I talk about in that stanza. So it felt very risky to publish, but I was appreciative of the validation of that kind of risky imagery that I received through the acceptance and publication in Superstition Review. So I think that as poets, sometimes we scare ourselves, and I certainly am doing that all the time, and noticing my fear and always discerning whether what I write and how I broadcast that writing is constructive or not constructive. And I think the violent imagery in this poem is certainly not gratuitous and is meant to make a larger political and personal statement. So that's kind of my recap of stanza 3. In stanza 4, kind of all hell breaks loose and the universe begins to dissolve and break apart, and imagery of physics comes into that, which comes a little bit from my scientific writing that I've done for a number of years. And a lot of physics I see as metaphor, because physics has to speak in models. We can't every day see subatomic particles, so we have this concept of, for example, what an atom is and what it's composed of. But that's really a metaphor for actually what's there, which we can see with super powerful microscopes, but to speak about them from day to day, it's really a metaphor and a model, and kind of just an image that we use to relate to those concepts. So in that way, I've always found physics very poetic and very very in line with the poetic project. They're working in metaphor as well. And those images within this stanza, again, relate back to issues of power. The power of breaking apart rather than trying so hard to hold an identity together. Just as when an electron jumps from one orbit to another, energy is released. And then when you break apart the nucleus of an atom, of course, a much stronger, incredibly destructive energy is released. But in the breaking apart of things, in the falling apart, in the disintegration, there's a certain power. And I think I use that as a metaphor here for reclaiming a personal power within the poem. So that's my quick recap of Cosmology Fourscore, my poem in issue 20 of Superstition Review. I'll touch really briefly on Transylvania Blue, which is a biography I'm currently writing about my great uncle, Stefan Moldovan, who was born in 1919 in the newly formed Czechoslovakia. Of course, that date was, it was a troubling time to be born in Eastern Europe as a Jew, because for a good 20 years, Czechoslovakia was a wonderful democracy that aspired to high ideals. But then, of course, World War II was on the horizon. And as a Jew, he and his family were in danger, were in great danger. A lot of the family didn't survive. But he had an extraordinary experience of survival through incredible odds and extraordinary experiences. First of all, being subject to forced labor, then being convicted of sabotage of the German war effort, being sentenced to 18 years in jail, spending a great deal of that in solitary confinement. There was a jailbreak. He escaped the prison. By that time, the Germans were on the horizon, and he had to hide with his older brother in the forest, taken care of by an elderly forester and his family, who risked their safety and their lives in order to save these two Jewish men who were my great uncles and who were a major part of my life and forming my identity. So once the war was over and they were free, they were liberated by the Red Army, and then, of course, the democracy of Czechoslovakia was destroyed, and they had to escape once again communism to Vienna in the middle of the night, running through a forest, escaping to freedom in Vienna. And then my Uncle Steve eventually made his way to Canada, where he became an engineer and left documentation, and including his own writing and photos and various documents about his extraordinary story. So I've really inherited a rich and painful history that I'm dedicating my time and efforts to putting down and sharing, because I think it's an important story, and so many stories of the Holocaust and the surrounding events still have not been told. Each one has its own particular importance. So this is really a major endeavor for me, and one that it's a pleasure to take on, to honor my ancestry and my great uncle, and a history that I think is important for us all to remember. So thanks again very much for watching. I appreciate it, your attention. And if you want to learn more about Transylvania Blue, please go to transylvaniablue.com and feel free to reach out to me there with your comments and reactions. Thanks again to Superstition Review for inviting me to contribute, and thanks for listening.